Chapter 9 is Stress and Adaptation. So in the body we have to maintain something called homeostasis. It's keeping all of the different things that are in the internal environment where the cells live within very narrow limits. So homeostasis is keeping things the same. The body requires this level of homeostasis. And what sort of things do we look at? Water balance, as in the previous chapter. We need to have the appropriate amount. We drink too much water, we'll urinate more. The weight of the body, blood glucose, in other words, what's your blood sugar? If it's too high, we'll secrete insulin to lower it. If it's too low, we'll secrete glucagon to raise it. Body temperature needs to be kept within narrow confines as well. And we saw there's different things, infections and so forth, that can cause an increase in your body's temperature. And your body increases its temperature in order to try to make the internal environment less hospitable to microorganisms like bacteria or viruses that might be wanting to make you sick. So negative feedback is how we keep things stable. Positive feedback causes them to become unstable, move their direction. So negative feedback is what we will always have for mechanisms to control things. So regardless of where we start with this, we'll always move around in a circle. So if we start here, for example, decreased blood glucose. Blood glucose is too low. Do we want to secrete insulin in this case? No, because insulin will lower the blood sugar more. So decrease insulin release, resulting in increased glucose in the blood. So blood glucose goes up. Now the sensor in the beta cell says blood glucose is elevated, so we will secrete insulin in order to decrease blood glucose. Negative feedback. We're always doing the opposite of the direction that is occurring in order to push it back within the limits. So we have this phrase, we have homeostasis, which is keeping things about the same. Allostasis is kind of a different way of saying this. We're remaining stable, the stasis, by being variable. Allo means variable. And so we respond to different environmental stressors, whether they're physiological or psychological, and that helps us maintain the stability. So if we look at something where we see there's a difference, this is on a psychological basis, a difference between the perceived situation and the desired situation will cause us to take action. We see that with our own actions. We can also see it on a cellular level. The cells are able to determine that something needs to change, and so the organ systems will make changes in order to return us to the narrow confines in which the cells are comfortable. pH of 7.35 to 7.45, body temperature of 98.6 Fahrenheit. All those different things need to be stable, and it's negative feedback that causes that. So we have something called general adaptation syndrome, also referred to as generalized stress syndrome. We hear a lot about stress nowadays, but it's relatively recently that all this work on what the effects of stress are has been done. So we have something called corticotropin releasing hormone. This is going to come from the hypothalamus. Remember, releasing tells us something's from the hypothalamus. Also antidiuretic hormone. Why? This is adapting to stress. We'll hang on to the fluid that we need. So by urinating less, we have more fluid available. Sympathetic nervous system activation. Sympathetic is fight or flight. This is what makes your heart beat faster, sends blood to your muscles, decreases the blood that's going to your digestive system. For example, renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone pathway activation. This is going to be a pathway that will help our body hang on to fluid, and it will drive our blood pressure up, which is how we respond to stress. Long-term elevated blood pressure isn't good for us, but in the short term, to adapt to acute stress, it's important. So we have stressors, and if we look at this, changing something with the internal environment, well, the cells don't like this. They want things to return to normal. We'll have signs and symptoms of this change. Signs are something objective that we look at. Someone's temperature is elevated, someone's blood pressure is elevated. Symptoms are things that a person will tell us about. They're subjective, whether it's a headache, feeling tired, and so forth. So signs are objective and symptoms are subjective. Anybody can see your signs. Symptoms is what you have to tell them about. So general adaptation response will help maintain normal function in spite of this stressor, and then we'll see signs and symptoms of this response. So whatever has taken place, we'll be able to see what the changes were that allowed us to adapt to what was going on. So let us say, for example, you get an infection. Well, if we wanted to look for a sign of it, we would see for perhaps bacteria in your blood. What would we then see when your body's trying to fight against this? We're going to raise our body temperature. We would be able to see that as a specific sign. So cortisol is the stress hormone, and it helps regulate this response. We have this hypothalamic anterior pituitary adrenal cortex system here, and in other classes you may have heard this referred to as the hypothalamus being the president and the anterior pituitary being the vice president. So the flow is down in this direction. So what do we need to have? Corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus tells anterior pituitary to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will travel to the adrenal cortex secreting cortisol. Cortex means like a rind or a bark, so this is on the outside of the adrenal glands secreting cortisol. What's it going to do? Increase glucose. It's going to essentially make fuel that's ready to use for a short-term problem. It's also going to suppress inflammatory and immune responses. We don't want to spend time and effort working on these problems when we have a short-term challenge that we need to meet. It becomes problematic when stress becomes chronic, and then we're inflamed, our immune responses aren't as good as they should be. But in the short term, this is precisely what we need. So cortisol release, what does it do? Increases blood glucose, and will also have an effect on the heart rate. We will decrease non-essential energy activities, hormone production, metabolic rate, and reproductive function. So we're not going to worry about digesting our food. We're not going to worry about reproduction. Something is going on that is a stressor that we need to deal with. We'll reduce bone formation, red and white blood cell production. So our immune system will be depressed by cortisol. So cortisol, question, why does the production of it result in increased blood glucose? So we read through these things, but the key answer, glucose is used for energy. We need more energy to deal with whatever the stressor is. The body's energy requirements increase during periods of stress. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and one of its effects is elevating blood glucose level. Elevated glucose is fine for short-term problems. Chronic elevated glucose is harmful to you. It's very inflammatory and it damages a lot of different parts of your body. That's why diabetes, where you have elevated glucose, is harmful as a chronic disease. Antidiuretic hormone is also called vasopressin. It causes your body to hang on to water. It also causes vasoconstriction. So this is going to drive up your blood pressure and help you deal with stress. Alright, so now we look at the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, rapid response to trauma or emergency. This is the shaky feeling that you get after something scary has happened. So whatever it is, pain, fear, also in response to low blood pressure, detected at the hypothalamus, sympathetic nervous system is activated, norepinephrine is released, and adrenal medulla will release epinephrine into the bloodstream. So receptors are called adrenergic receptors on cells that will respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epi means above or on top of, and nephr is kidney. So this is the same as adrenal, which is why its name is adrenaline, and then norepinephrine, noradrenaline. And blood pressure could be restored. Remember, we saw right here low blood pressure. Maybe you're injured and bleeding, so we want our sympathetic nervous system to drive the blood pressure back up. Blood flow to skin, intestine or gut, and kidney is reduced. This is very useful in order to preserve the blood flow to the brain, but it can cause harm to these organs. Particularly the kidneys are sensitive to a lack of blood flow. Pale skin, because we're not sending as much blood there. Decreased urine production, decreased gastrointestinal activity. These are all kind of unnecessary things when we have a major problem that we're dealing with. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, increasing heart rate, increasing strength of cardiac contractions, vasoconstriction in the skin, in the gut, in the kidneys, all of these things are going to drive your blood pressure up. Then we have the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. It's activated by the sympathetic, so sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight, as well as decreased blood flow to the kidneys. So kidneys release renin, then angiotensin 1 is formed, causes weak vasoconstriction. Angiotensin converting enzyme is a hormone, ACE, so an ACE inhibitor prevents this. If we wanted to keep your blood pressure lower, we might give you an ACE inhibitor to prevent angiotensin 1 from becoming angiotensin 2. But in this case, we want this to take place because we want vasoconstriction. We want all the things that will happen as a result of angiotensin 2 in order for your body to hang on to fluids to be able to deal with whatever stress is taking place. So, angiotensin 2 has an effect on the adrenal cortex, causing it to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone causes your body to hang on to sodium, which causes it to hang on to water. Question: tell whether the following statement is true or false. Angiotensin converting enzyme must be present in order for aldosterone to be released by the adrenal gland. So let's look. Angiotensin converting enzyme causes angiotensin 1 to become angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 has an effect on the adrenal cortex, and then aldosterone is released. So our answer is true. Without angiotensin converting enzyme, angiotensin 2 could not be created, and it's angiotensin 2 that stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone. So we continue. Aldosterone in the kidneys tells the kidney to hang on to sodium, which causes it to hang on to water. We'll also secrete potassium, because if we're hanging on to one positive charge thing, there has to be something else to keep the balance. And increased blood volume. Oliguria. Urea is urination. Oligo means a few. So you're going to decrease the amount of urine. That's what oliguria means. Decreased amount of urine. Alright, so this is a repeat of the slide before, showing us what is going on. This general adaptation response, helping to maintain normal function in spite of whatever the stressor is. So we see that we have a stressor, we can see the signs and symptoms of that, and then we can look for how the body has adapted to it. So here's a slide showing the interaction between central nervous system, the immune system. What's going on? There's some kind of stress, whatever it is, overwork, problems with coworkers, all these different things that are mentioned in the book. Hormones and neurotransmitters can affect your immune cells, can reduce the immune system's ability to fight off things that would make you sick. Also, inflammatory mediators can be generated, so you get this combination of not being able to avoid getting sick and chronic inflammation taking place, which in turn is stressful, makes you worry, makes you not feel well, right? For example, a lot of work, you're working overtime, you're not getting along with your coworkers, you have an exam coming up in a class, and now you've gotten sick from your immune system not working as well. Or you have this chronic inflammation and you don't feel well, it keeps cycling around. You have to find a way to break that cycle. So effects of stress on the immune system: decreased immune cell production, decreased activity of the thymus, which is an important part of your immune system, and changes in the kind of immune cells produced. So stress is harmful for your immune system. This is why a lot of times people they're overworked, they're stressed out, and then they get sick. They get sick more easily. So question: how does this affect your immune system? Thymus atrophies, fewer lymphocytes, inflammatory mediators are released. All of the above, all these different things. And this is chronic stress that's difficult to deal with. Short-term stress, where it's something exciting or fun, is good for you, but chronic stress that's difficult to deal with is bad for your immune system. So stress causes the immune system to be suppressed. Fewer T lymphocytes, monocytes, and lymphocytes may cross the blood-brain barrier and release inflammatory mediators and cytokines. They shouldn't normally be able to cross the blood-brain barrier, so this becomes even more problematic. Physiologic stress is what we're talking about on this slide. Contrast this with psychosocial stress. So physiological stress, this is due to something that's going on. Maybe it's too warm, maybe it's too cold, maybe any number of different things that affect the body. So stress-induced changes in body function. It's detected by your body's normal regulatory sensors. In other words, you're sick and you're throwing up, so you've gotten rid of acids, your acid-base balance is thrown off. Your body's going to have to adapt to this. So we want to restore a normal balance. When the normal balance is restored, negative feedback will stop whatever is taking place. That's physiological stress. Contrast this with psychosocial stress. This is what you feel. Maybe you go into a room of strangers that you need to talk to and you don't know anyone. Directly affects the central nervous system. Something scary happens to you, or you think something scary might happen to you. Turns on the stress response even when the body's internal sensors have not detected an imbalance. Because there's not an imbalance, there's something affecting your central nervous system. You become aware of it. So, do the stress responses solve the person's problem? In other words, you walk into a room full of people you don't know, you have to talk to them, you start feeling scared, your heart starts beating faster. Does that help? Not as a rule. It makes you aware that you're frightened. So, as a rule, it makes you feel worse. Will negative feedback tell them when to turn off? Well, they're not doing this in response to anything that the internal sensors are detecting, so there's no sort of negative feedback that is possible. So, long-term stress, chronic stress, sympathetic nervous system activity, and cortisol are elevated. You can get problems from a reduced immune response just to chronic stress. We contrast this with something else, post-traumatic stress disorder. Something very scary has happened to you, and you are unable to not think about it. There's intrusion into your thoughts. There's hypervigilance that takes place. Sympathetic system is activated just like in chronic stress, except there is a fundamental difference. Cortisol levels are decreased in post-traumatic stress disorder, and the book describes this as a sign that you could actually look at for something being diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder versus, for example, depression, where cortisol levels would be increased.